The early 1990s on the west coast of the United States were painted green, not with envy or jealousy, but with a full-on cultural surge toward environmental awareness and action. This wasn't a fringe movement or a background narrative tucked away in the shadows of louder, flashier trends. It was front and center, a loud and proud campaign to save the planet, and it embedded itself in nearly every layer of everyday life. This wasn't just about activists chaining themselves to redwoods or lobbyists in Sacramento. It was mass participation, complete with cartoon mascots, elementary school assemblies, cafeteria recycling drives, and slogans printed on everything from lunchboxes to cereal boxes. Environmentalism wasn't just trending. It was expected. And nowhere did it find a more enthusiastic stage than California, where the sun-drenched coastline seemed tailor-made for green thinking. The state charged ahead like a tie-dyed general, wielding a biodegradable flag, leading the country in conservation, messaging that felt as much like a moral obligation as it did a pop culture phenomenon. Across the sprawling Pacific coast, from San Diego up to Eureka, children were sorting recyclables before they fully understood what the word sustainability even meant. Separate bins for paper, plastic, and aluminum were more than a good habit. They were a civic duty, reinforced by adults with laminated charts and lots of exclamation points. Public schools eagerly handed out Earth Day stickers and pamphlets like they were currency. In many classrooms, you couldn't take a step without bumping into a laminated poster featuring a cartoon dolphin with a tear rolling down its cheek, or a smiling Earth wrapped in a heart-shaped recycling symbol. Above chalkboards and on hallway bulletin boards, slogans like "Only you can prevent pollution" and "Think globally, act locally" reminded students that they were already foot soldiers in the fight to protect the planet. The roots of this moment stretched back decades, through a slow accumulation of lessons that Americans did not exactly volunteer to learn. Post-war prosperity had brought highways, suburban lawns, plastics, pesticides, and smokestacks. And for a while, it seemed as if the only cost of modern life was having to sit in traffic. Then the bills started coming due. People watched rivers that were supposed to be symbols of life turn into industrial runoff channels. And in a few notorious cases, they even caught fire, as if water itself had finally decided it had had enough. Oil slicks washed up on beaches and clung to rocks and feathers with an ugly persistence that made denial difficult. Children were poisoned by lead and pesticides in ways that were invisible at first and devastating later. The kind of harm that didn't arrive with a bang, but with a slow, grim realization that something in the everyday environment had become quietly hostile. Out of that stew of alarm and disgust came the landmark moments that turned environmental concern from a nagging suspicion into a national project. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring gave the public a new language for connecting the health of birds, soil, water, and human bodies. And it gave them a villain that was not foreign or mysterious, but familiar, the cheerful chemical confidence of the modern age. The first Earth Day in 1970 arrived as a kind of civic awakening, half teach-in and half street demonstration, proving that millions of Americans could be coaxed into thinking about something other than their own immediate routines. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency made the whole thing official, transforming what had been moral outrage and citizen activism into a governmental responsibility, with budgets, enforcement powers, and enough acronyms to satisfy even the most paperwork-loving bureaucrats. California, in particular, had emerged as an environmental laboratory, sometimes by choice and sometimes because its problems were simply too obvious to ignore. Its booming population and car culture created smog so thick it became a daily reminder that air was not guaranteed to be clean just because it was free. The state pushed vehicle emission standards forward, not only out of idealism, but out of necessity, and its coastal protections reflected a stubborn refusal to treat the Pacific as a convenient dumping ground with scenic views. At the same time, California embodied the contradictions that made environmental politics so lively. The same place that pioneered regulation also championed sprawling development. The same state that adored its beaches also built endlessly to live near them. The same West Coast imagination that celebrated nature as sacred scenery also had a talent for reshaping it into real estate. By the late 1980s, environmentalism already had laws, agencies, and nonprofits. It had professional lobbyists, earnest pamphlets, and a well-practiced ability to sue people into compliance. What it lacked was urgency, that hot, buzzing energy that turns concern into a mass cultural obsession. That changed quickly and not subtly. The surge that carried environmentalism into the cultural mainstream at the turn of the decade was fueled by a perfect storm of fear, optimism, and visibility, the kind of rare alignment that makes a movement feel less like a movement and more like the air everyone happens to be breathing. The late Cold War period ended not with nuclear fire, but with an unexpected sigh of relief as the Soviet Union collapsed and Americans realized, somewhat disoriented, that the world had not ended after all. For decades, the shadow of superpower annihilation had hovered over everything like an invisible ceiling. And then suddenly, the ceiling lifted. With the existential threat of a mushroom cloud receding, public attention drifted inward. People looked around and noticed the state of their own house. Problems like pollution, deforestation, and toxic waste suddenly seemed like the biggest threats left standing. Not because they were new, but because the old apocalyptic menace had stepped aside and left room for other anxieties to take center stage. At the same time, science delivered a series of messages that were simple enough to fit in a headline and frightening enough to lodge in the imagination. There was a hole in the ozone layer, and the phrase itself sounded like something you'd say about a leaky roof right before the rain starts. Acid rain was killing forests, a concept so unfair it felt almost personal, as if the weather had turned against the trees. Oil spills were smothering wildlife in an image that required no translation. Dark water, pale sand, struggling animals, and a sense of helplessness that made people want to do something, anything, even if something was just signing a petition or buying a different brand of paper towels. These dangers were visible, photographable, and narratively neat, with clear victims and plausible villains, especially compared to the abstract math of carbon emissions and climate modeling. Global warming was an idea. A slick-covered pelican was a punch to the gut. The Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 was a particular turning point, especially on the West Coast, where images of oil-soaked birds resonated deeply with a population already primed to care about coastlines and marine life. The spill happened far from California beaches, yet it felt close, like a warning sent down the entire Pacific edge of the continent. It also arrived at a moment when media could carry environmental catastrophe directly into living rooms with nightly repetition, turning outrage into something almost communal. People who had never set foot in Alaska still felt they knew the story. A massive ship, a terrible mistake, and a fragile ecosystem paying the price. Disasters like that had a way of clarifying priorities. They made environmentalism feel less like an abstract moral preference and more like the obvious response to a clear emergency. The following year, Earth Day's 20th anniversary became a kind of environmental coming out party, a celebration that doubled as a declaration that caring about the planet was no longer just for activists, scientists, or the sort of neighbors who composted so enthusiastically they started offering unsolicited advice about banana peels. Over 20 million Americans participated. Recycling drives multiplied until it seemed every school and community group had a mountain of newspapers somewhere, tied with twine and stacked with righteous purpose. Teachers staged assemblies. Students made posters. Parents nodded solemnly while secretly hoping the event wouldn't involve a bake sale made entirely of bran. Corporations hurried to rebrand themselves with shades of green, discovering overnight that the color could be used to suggest purity, responsibility, and an almost spiritual friendliness toward dolphins. Surveys showed that 3/4 of Americans now called themselves environmentalists. A number so large, it effectively stripped the word of any radical edge. When nearly everyone claims the label, it stops marking the boundary of a movement and starts functioning like good manners. Environmental concern had become a civic virtue, like voting, wearing a seatbelt, or at least pretending to know what you were doing when you separated glass from paper. On the West Coast, this awareness blended seamlessly into lifestyle, partly because the region had long sold itself as a place where nature and modern life were supposed to coexist in a flattering tableau. Recycling bins became standard household furniture, as familiar as the junk drawer, and sometimes just as mysterious in their contents. People debated whether rinsing out a yogurt cup was a moral duty or a pointless ritual performed for the gods of municipal waste management. Organic food migrated from co-ops into mainstream grocery stores, shedding some of its patchouli aura as it went, until it became less a statement and more an option with a slightly higher price tag. Farmers markets multiplied, turning weekend errands into small festivals of local identity. Environmental consciousness showed up in everything from the rise of reusable canvas bags to the mild social embarrassment of being seen with too much plastic, a quiet pressure that could be remarkably effective. Cities like Portland, San Francisco, and Seattle treated environmental awareness as a marker of local identity, part of the same regional personality that prized coffee, outdoor gear, and the ability to discuss neighborhood politics with both passion and specificity. The landscape itself encouraged the habit, mountains visible from the freeway, ocean air drifting into city streets, forests close enough to visit after work. It was hard to pretend nature was somewhere else when it was always looming in the background, gorgeous and occasionally on fire. Even the tech boom carried a strange, complicated relationship to environmental ideals. The West Coast liked to imagine itself as innovative and forward-thinking, and caring about the planet fit nicely into that self-image. A way of being modern that didn't require feeling cynical. Protests against logging in old-growth forests, particularly in Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, turned environmentalism into physical theater. These were not tidy disputes. They were clashes of livelihoods, identities, and competing visions of what forests were for. Logging towns saw environmentalists as outsiders threatening jobs. Environmentalists saw clear cuts as a kind of vandalism carried out with paperwork and heavy machinery. The drama was heightened by the fact that old-growth forests are not subtle. They look ancient because they are. A redwood does not seem like a resource in the same way a stack of lumber does. It seems like a presence, something closer to a cathedral than a commodity. Julia Butterfly Hill's 2-year tree sit in a California redwood was activism that played well on television. Dramatic, symbolic, and rooted, quite literally, in place. The image of a lone person living high above the ground in a single tree turned the abstract into the personal. It also suggested a kind of devotion that was hard to dismiss as mere trend chasing, even for skeptics. Tree sits, blockades, and marches made environmentalism feel embodied, not just legislative. They transformed forests from background scenery into contested territory and reminded viewers that land use policy was not a distant bureaucratic matter, but something people would quite literally risk their bodies for. Popular culture did its part to make environmentalism unavoidable, if not always subtle, by weaving it into the everyday entertainment diet of the era, the way earlier decades had woven in cowboy ethics or Cold War spy paranoia. On the West Coast especially, where the ocean was always nearby and the mountains were always visible, the idea of nature didn't feel like an abstract concept from a textbook. It felt like something that could be visited on a weekend, inhaled on a morning commute, and mourned when it looked hazy or smelled wrong. No piece of media captured this better than Captain Planet and the Planeteers, a brightly colored animated series produced by Ted Turner's Turner Broadcasting, headquartered in Atlanta, but animated, written, and culturally shaped by the same West Coast sensibilities that powered much of 1990s television. Captain Planet debuted in 1990, just in time to ride the wave of Earth Day's 20th anniversary, and wasted no time announcing its intentions. Its villains were not misunderstood, rogues, or morally complex antagonists. They were literal embodiments of pollution, toxic waste, deforestation, and industrial greed. Captain Planet himself emerged when 5 ethnically diverse teenagers, assembled like an eco-conscious United Nations, combined their elemental rings and shouted a phrase that would echo through living rooms at 6 a.m. for years. The show's background was rooted in a belief that children could be taught environmental responsibility through repetition, clarity, and the occasional green-haired superhero. Its impact was immediate and unmistakable. For a generation of West Coast kids raised amid recycling drives, drought warnings, and field trips to tide pools, Captain Planet felt less like fantasy and more like civic instruction with better theme music. Critics found the messaging heavy-handed, and even at the time, there was gentle mockery of its earnestness. But the show succeeded in making environmental protection feel urgent, heroic, and non-negotiable. If nothing else, it established the idea that caring about the Earth was not a fringe position. It was the default setting. While Captain Planet dominated television, animated films took a more mystical route through the forest. FernGully, the last rainforest, released in 1992, arrived with the subtlety of a chainsaw, but the heart of a West Coast drum circle. Set in an Australian rainforest, but very much shaped by American environmental anxieties, the film told the story of tiny forest fairies battling a shape-shifting embodiment of pollution voiced by Tim Curry. Its development reflected a growing concern with deforestation, rainforest loss, and the looming presence of industrial machinery. Though its setting was global, its tone matched the California environmental mood perfectly. Nature was magical, industry was reckless, and redemption was possible if humans would just listen. FernGully's impact was less about box office dominance and more about psychological scarring. Children left theaters with a new fear of logging equipment and a vague sense that every paper product carried moral weight. Its songs lingered, its villains terrified, and its message was clear enough that no adult explanation was required. It was environmentalism presented as fantasy, but the fantasy was thinly veiled. Once Upon a Forest, released a year later, took an even gentler approach while somehow managing to be more emotionally devastating. This film followed a group of woodland animals attempting to save a poisoned badger after a chemical spill invades their forest. Its development leaned heavily into the era's concerns about toxic waste, industrial accidents, and invisible environmental threats. The film did not rely on spectacle so much as atmosphere, sadness, and the quiet horror of environmental harm that arrives silently and without warning. It was less preachy than some of its peers, but perhaps more unsettling, embedding the idea that pollution was not just ugly, it was lethal, personal, and unfair. Hovering above all of this, quietly judging everyone, was Lisa Simpson. As The Simpsons became one of the most influential television shows of the decade, Lisa emerged as its moral compass and environmental conscience. Her development as a character mirrored the era's fixation perfectly. She was idealistic, informed, frequently ignored, and usually right. Episodes centered on recycling, animal rights, pollution, and corporate malfeasance positioned Lisa as the voice of reason in a world that preferred convenience to responsibility. The Simpsons used Lisa to both promote and gently critique environmental concern. Her activism was portrayed as noble but exhausting, necessary but lonely. The show acknowledged the importance of environmental awareness while also recognizing how difficult it was to sustain in a culture addicted to consumption. Lisa's impact was subtle but lasting. She normalized environmental concern not as a phase, but as an ethical stance, one that might not always win, but should never be abandoned. Even action stars got involved, as Hollywood briefly entertained the notion that punching an oil executive might save the planet. The decade produced its share of movies where the bad guy was not a foreign agent, but a corporation with a pipeline, a smokestack, or a private security force guarding a toxic secret. The fantasy was blunt, but emotionally satisfying. If the problem was greed, then maybe a righteous hero could simply throw greed through a window. The tone ranged from sincere to absurd, sometimes within the same franchise, but the message was consistent. Caring about the environment was normal, and not caring was suspicious. It was one of the few moral positions a person could take in public without needing to explain much, like saying you wanted clean water or safe neighborhoods. Environmentalism became less a niche identity and more a shared cultural reflex, the kind of belief that could be expressed through a slogan on a t-shirt, a classroom poster, or a recycling bin placed prominently in the kitchen like a small household altar. Politically, the early 1990s seemed to confirm that this concern might translate into lasting change, not just into more movies about talking trees. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 successfully tackled acid rain, proving that regulation could work and that environmental policy did not automatically equal economic ruin. For many Americans, that mattered as much as the chemical details. It suggested the problem-solving machinery of government could still function, still set targets, still enforce rules, and still produce measurable improvements that ordinary people could recognize in clearer skies and healthier lakes. International cooperation, symbolized by the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, suggested that global problems might finally receive global solutions, or at least that the world's leaders were willing to gather in the same room and admit that the planet was not an endless resource pantry. The language of the era leaned toward optimism. Treaties, frameworks, summits, declarations, the promise that science could guide policy if politics would just hold still long enough. At the same time, environmentalism expanded beyond wilderness imagery and charismatic animals, and that expansion complicated it in ways pop culture rarely captured. Environmental justice entered the national vocabulary, bringing attention to the fact that pollution did not land evenly across a map, and that some communities had been treated as sacrifice zones for generations. On the West Coast, this included neighborhoods near ports where diesel exhaust was constant, towns downwind of refineries, communities bordering freeways that functioned like perpetual exhaust vents, and agricultural regions where pesticide exposure was a lived reality rather than a theoretical risk. The movement's focus began to shift from saving distant rainforests to confronting the toxic burdens at home, in places where the victims could speak for themselves and the solutions required more than good intentions. For a brief moment, environmentalism appeared broad, moral, and forward-looking, buoyed by the sense that history itself was bending in the right direction. It felt, at least in the glow of early decade victories and well-attended rallies, as if awareness was finally becoming governance, as if slogans might harden into laws, and as if a generation raised on recycling heroes might actually grow up and rewrite the rules of the real world. Yet even as environmentalism peaked culturally, the seeds of its decline were already present, tucked into the very successes that made the era feel so triumphant. The movement struggled to evolve beyond the visible, headline-friendly crises that had helped it break into the mainstream in the first place. The ozone hole could be discussed with a kind of grim clarity. Certain chemicals were causing a measurable problem in the sky, and eliminating those chemicals could plausibly lead to improvement. Acid rain, too, offered a cause and effect story that ordinary people could follow without a chemistry degree, and policymakers could point to tangible reductions in sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides as proof that the system worked. These were problems that felt, in a strange way, conquerable. They were scary, but they were also shaped like problems Americans already knew how to solve. Identify the culprit, pass a law, invent or require better technology, and watch the graphs start inching in the right direction. Climate change did not cooperate with that storyline. Even when it was discussed as global warming, it arrived in the public imagination as something distant and almost theoretical, an argument about averages rather than an emergency with a single dramatic image. It demanded sacrifices instead of symbolic gestures, and it threatened to reorder everyday life in ways that made people defensive long before they became convinced. It did not offer a satisfying villain that could be defeated in 90 minutes or less. It was everyone and no one. Power plants, cars, suburbs, consumption, convenience. And because it was gradual, it was easy to postpone emotionally. A dead fish floating in a river could spark outrage in a single photograph. A projected temperature increase decades away required trust, patience, and a willingness to worry about a future that still felt abstract. For a movement that had ridden the power of vivid, easily communicated threats, that shift in scale and visibility was a serious problem. As the decade progressed, environmental messaging began to feel repetitive, even preachy, in part because it became so ubiquitous. The slogans and jingles that once felt urgent started to sound like background noise, especially to adults who had already made the simple changes they were willing to make. Children could be taught to pick up litter and separate cans from paper, but grown-ups were less enthusiastic about hearing that their commutes, their heating bills, and their vacation flights were part of the problem. Pop culture reflected this tonal shift. What had once been delivered with wide-eyed sincerity increasingly became a setup for a joke. The very presence of environmentalism everywhere, on packaging, in classrooms, in corporate ads, in sitcom plotlines, made it easier to parody. Satire slowly replaced sincerity, not because people stopped caring entirely, but because earnestness is hard to sustain when it becomes compulsory. The preachiness of the messaging was another contributing factor in its own undermining, in part because it completely missed the mark as to how fragile the environment actually is. Shows like Captain Planet, together with FernGully, gave the impression that either magic or a superhero would come out of nowhere and save the day every time, repairing any damage and restoring the environment to health. Every action could be resolved, and this gave the completely improper perception that it didn't matter how much damage you did to the environment, either accidentally or deliberately, someone, somewhere, would come and fix it, either through magic beams punching a villain into next week. or by singing a song. This media had no nuance, and in their drive to shove this messaging down the throats of viewers, they actually failed to tell children that the environment cannot just be fixed if you dream hard enough or wish upon a star. In fact, the closest of these movies to delivering a message that not all damage is repairable is Once Upon a Forest, which surprisingly strayed from the usual cornerstones of environmentalist media messaging, even going so far as to depict the human characters causing the pollution as not entirely evil. At the same time, characters like Lisa Simpson became disliked due to her perceived self-righteousness, hypocrisy, and preachy attitude, where her intelligence often comes across as arrogance or a superiority complex, leading her to alienate others, sabotage rivals, and occasionally act hypocritically despite her strong moral stances, like being a vegetarian while secretly eating truffles or rejecting money for dirty sources. In this capacity, and in order to try and drive her messaging home, her character arc shifted from a relatable child voice of reason to a more extreme, sometimes annoying activist, even in the 1990s, making viewers feel she's some holier-than-thou character who is overly critical. As for Biodome, no, just no. Politics accelerated the cooling off. By the mid-1990s, political winds shifted sharply, turning environmental regulation from a broadly supported public good into a recurring battlefield. The 1994 elections ushered in a Congress openly hostile to environmental regulation, and environmental protections were reframed as obstacles to economic growth, job creation, and personal freedom. Instead of arguing about clean air and clean water as shared goals, the debate increasingly became about costs, mandates, and what opponents called overreach. Funding was cut, enforcement weakened, agencies were pressured to do more with less, and scientific findings became easier to dismiss as just another opinion in a newly hardened partisan climate. The bipartisan consensus that had briefly sustained major environmental gains fractured into suspicion and trench warfare. And once the subject became coded as ideological, it was harder for the movement to keep its Big Tent identity. Cultural fatigue played a role as well, and it showed up most clearly in the everyday habits that had once been treated like tiny acts of heroism. When everyone is an environmentalist, enthusiasm becomes background noise. Recycling turned into routine rather than rebellion. The blue bin ceased to feel like a statement and became, at best, another chore. Organic food, once associated with co-ops and earnest conversations about soil, became just another premium product. Something you bought if you could afford it and ignored if you couldn't. Green started to look less like a moral awakening and more like a branding strategy, which bred cynicism, even among people who wanted the underlying ideals to succeed. When environmental concern began to arrive wrapped in marketing language, it also invited a certain eye-rolling suspicion. Was this still about the planet, or was it about selling a more expensive shampoo? Anyway, on the West Coast, where the environmental wave had been especially strong, the complications were impossible to miss. The region still prided itself on clean energy dreams, scenic protections, and a general affection for nature, but it was also a place where growth pressures collided with ideals in very public ways. Housing crises intensified, pushing people farther from city centers and turning commutes into daily rituals of exhaust and frustration. Economic inequality became harder to ignore, and environmental policies sometimes looked to struggling families like the preferences of people who had the luxury to care. Even well-intended regulations could feel like another layer of difficulty in places where the cost of living climbed faster than wages. The West Coast remained the beating heart of environmental idealism, but it was now beating in a crowded room, surrounded by urgent social and economic stresses that competed for attention. Environmentalism didn't disappear, but it lost its sense of inevitability, that earlier feeling that the culture had turned a corner and would keep marching forward together. Meanwhile, the movement itself wrestled with an uncomfortable contradiction. It was easier to rally around saving whales, protecting redwoods, or reducing visible smog than it was to build lasting agreement about systemic change. The public had been trained by media, by schools, by campaigns to respond to concrete villains and clear solutions. But the biggest problem on the horizon was a slow-building consequence of the entire modern lifestyle. That mismatch created a lingering frustration frustration. People knew in a general way that something was wrong, but they were less sure what to do beyond the familiar rituals. The sense of empowerment that came from small actions began to bump up against the suspicion that small actions weren't enough. And when a movement starts to feel like it is asking for constant effort without obvious payoff, it risks turning enthusiasm into resignation. The final blow came not from policy, but from history itself, the way history has of barging in and rearranging priorities without asking permission. By the end of the decade, global warming loomed larger, harder, and more divisive than the environmental issues that had preceded it. It wasn't that the old issues had vanished. It was that they no longer seemed like the whole story. Then, in 2001, national attention snapped abruptly toward terrorism, security, and war. The emotional space that had once been occupied by rainforests and whales was filled by entirely different fears, more immediate and more violent, with images that dominated screens and conversations. The country's attention narrowed. Public energy redirected itself toward protection and retaliation. In that atmosphere, long-term environmental concerns struggled to compete, not because it mattered less in reality, but because it felt less urgent to a society suddenly living in a different kind of anxiety. The environmental obsession of the 1990s faded not because it was resolved, but because it required a level of calm, optimism, and collective focus that the new century no longer allowed. Looking back, the environmental obsession of the early 90s may strike some as simplistic or overly earnest. To modern eyes, it can seem a little naive, maybe even cheesy. But there's also something beautiful about that moment in time. A moment when kids, parents, teachers, pop stars, and even corporations briefly aligned around a common ideal. It was clumsy, sure, and sometimes sanctimonious, but it was also sincere. It represented a rare window when environmentalism wasn't just a political position or a marketing strategy. It was a cultural norm. It was in the water, the air, the morning announcements. And maybe, just maybe, there's room for that kind of optimism again. Maybe the world needs fewer eye rolls and more animated dolphins. Maybe Captain Planet deserves a second chance, not just as a rebooted cartoon, but as a cultural symbol for a new generation that's already grappling with climate anxiety on a global scale. Because despite all the progress, all the apps and smart thermostats and biodegradable packaging, the stakes are higher now. The problems are more complex. But the goal hasn't changed. And deep down, somewhere between nostalgia and necessity, that old message still resonates. The power is yours.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel online on X, we're here just for you.